Yes, a married mother of two who abandons her family when she sees a soft-masked lesbian playing guitar on the beach. A true fairy tale classic. Tale as old as time. Bored married woman and the lesbian. I've been discovering some really amazing lesbian feminist cinema from the 1970s recently, and it's healing my soul. In fact, lesbian feminist cinema from the 1970s is now my kink. Well, that and when you're sitting in a coffee shop reading a book and it starts to rain outside. Oh God, I've said too much. I have to say, when I first came across A Woman Like Eve, I was wary of the whole married woman has an affair aspect of it. Yeah, I thought it was going to be full of reductive tropes and thus went into it with my expectations on the floor. However, I ended up being pleasantly surprised by this film. And not only is A Woman Like Eve a beautiful, thought-provoking piece of work, but it's also a lesser talked about landmark in lesbian cinema, which, as a bonus, has some incredibly interesting lore. Also, I think this movie may have been sponsored by 7-Up. Well, I got the vague hint of an idea that it was anyway. I mean, do they really think audiences are that brain dead that they're just going to go out and buy this soft drink because they saw someone drinking it on a screen? Damn, that's fresh. Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video we're just going to be discussing the 1979 Dutch film A Woman Like Eve. If you're not familiar with A Woman Like Eve, it tells the story of a married woman, Ava, who leaves her husband and their two young children after meeting and falling in love with Lilian, a free-spirited young bohemian living in a rural commune. Following their affair, Ava battles both to gain custody of her children and against the social stigma she encounters for rejecting a traditional heteronormative lifestyle in order to follow her heart's desire. So, some interesting facts about this film. First of all, it was made by a production crew of primarily women and directed by feminist filmmaker Nushka van Brakel. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm not, I apologise. Who wrote the screenplay with acclaimed Jewish writer Judith Herzberg. Secondly, Van Brakel was initially reluctant to cast Monique van der Van in the role of Ava, as she was concerned the 26-year-old actress was too young for the role. However, Van der Van had her heart set on the part, so much so in fact that she reportedly turned down a major Hollywood film in order to make it. And through her persistence and determination, and allegedly a little sprinkling of threatening legal action, she eventually convinced Van Brakel to cast her. The role of Lilian is played by Maria Schneider, who took this role after leaving the 1979 film Caligula by Tinto Brass in protest over the nudity and exploitation. And for context to this, Schneider was severely mistreated in the 1972 film Last Tango in Paris, where a rape scene that wasn't initially in the script was sprung on her while shooting without her consent. Afterwards, Schneider received no support, was horrifically underpaid for the role, and was catapulted into the misogynistic media machine, where the press and public were unable to separate her from her character, leaving her understandably traumatized, which led to mental health issues and drug addiction. When shooting A Woman Like Eve, Schneider was fresh out of rehab, and there were reports of her having emotional problems on the set. And in my opinion, when watching the film, there does seem to be a troubled or cloistered energy surrounding her in certain scenes. However, I think this worked with her character and performance rather than against it. And within the context of Schneider's challenging history with the male-dominated film industry, her role in A Woman Like Eve is one of her most meaningful ones, due to it being a uniquely and unapologetically feminist production that stands out and against the sea of distortion and exploitation of women in cinema within the 1970s. And lastly, a radical lesbian group threatened the cast and crew of this film during filming at an outdoor festival because they were angry that Monique van der Van was cast in the role of Ava because she wasn't a real-life lesbian. The group even threatened Monique with violence and attempted to destroy the crew's camera. And that is why I avoid fights with other lesbians at all costs. There's a lot of repressed anger in our community, and I don't want any smoke, you know? below. I don't want to fight. I just want to, that's it. You know, that's all. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this situation down in the comments section below, because it's an interesting talking point. So as you can see, the lore behind this film, it's interesting and it contains almost as much social commentary as the film itself. Now, A Woman Like Eve also serves as a socio-political time capsule of the 1970s, of sorts, as it reflects the social movements and political discourse from that period. For example, the 1970s were a significant decade for second wave feminism, a movement that challenged both sexual norms for women and the societal constructs of gender and family roles, and these issues are explored in A Woman Like Eve through Ava questioning her place and personal happiness as a stay-at-home wife and mother, and with her pursuit of a relationship with another woman. As a piece of cinema, A Woman Like Eve is also significant because, as mentioned, it was created by primarily women in a time where the film industry was heavily male-dominated, and during a period where discussions about how women were portrayed and consumed through the male gaze in media were in focus. A Woman Like Eve is unique in that it shows female nudity and women in general in a way that isn't hypersexualized, objectifying, or made to appeal to a male fantasy. And notably, the film also focuses on a woman outside of her connection to men, two aspects which were radical for the time. And I would argue that parts of this film remain radical even to this day. A Woman Like Eve also reflects the growing awareness around homosexuality and gay rights in the 1970s, which was largely in part due to both the post-Stonewall gay liberation movement, which sought to challenge social oppression in a much more aggressive way than in previous decades, and to an increased visibility of homosexuality in the media due to changes in censorship laws across the US and Europe. The film is also a landmark in lesbian cinema, since it is one of the first to openly depict same-sex couple parenting in a positive way and portray lesbian discrimination during a custody battle, both of which was groundbreaking for the time. And A Woman Like Eve is made further unique by its depiction of lesbianism and lesbian intimacy through a female gaze, which stood out against the sea of hypersexualization, demonization, and exploitation of lesbianism and lesbian intimacy in media during that time. Moving on to the film itself, I found it to be an artistically meaningful piece of work, containing a lot of thoughtful cinematography that both crafted atmosphere and told a story by itself. As a side note, from a modern day perspective, there's also something incredibly comforting and nostalgic about watching vintage cinema, which made this film extra enjoyable to watch. The visual storytelling in A Woman Like Eve is also intelligent. For example, the film opens upon Ava looking out into the world and pacing restlessly from the confines of her home, which symbolizes her desire for freedom, a core theme for her character. And when Ava is on holiday, away from her husband and children, she takes off her bikini top, exposing herself. And it's during this scene that she first sees Lillian. So this action of Ava baring her chest, an action which goes against ideals of modesty and propriety projected onto women, and seeing Lillian in that same moment, not only symbolizes Ava rejecting convention and expectation, but also foreshadows the sexual freedom that she finds through Lillian, all of which are again relevant themes for her character in the film. Interestingly, Ava and Lillian's first interaction also takes place in the ocean, and this is significant since water is incredibly symbolic of emotion and female sexuality. And shortly after this, Lillian leaves Ava waving goodbye at her from the water, while she takes off for the mountains in a boat with other women from her commune. And it's notable that this scene ends with a shot of solely Ava waving goodbye, because it is later mirrored at the end of the film, where Lillian leaves Ava to go back to the commune instead of staying with her. And at the train station, there's a shot of Ava standing by herself after she has decided to miss the train, with a bystander in the background waving goodbye. So there's both a foreshadowing and a parallel of goodbyes between these two scenes, which I thought was interesting. And just from analysing these few scenes alone, you can see just how thoughtful the visual storytelling element of this film is. As for the lesbian element of this film, whilst I would classify A Woman Like Eve Eve as lesbian cinema. In truth, the lesbianism is only one element of the story, with the core focus being on Ava's emancipation. That said, the way Ava's lesbian awakening and relationship is portrayed is meaningful and one of the most engaging aspects of the film. There's one affecting scene in particular where Ava is crying over seeing Lillian with another woman, and as Lillian is comforting her, the two of them proceed to melt into one another in an incredibly poetic way. And in general, Schneider and Van der Vaan had a comfortable and magnetic connection with one another that was compelling to watch. As mentioned earlier, one of the most refreshing and unique aspects of the film is its female gaze. And even though the love scene between Ava and Lillian is explicit, the nudity doesn't feel salacious, nor is it the focus of their scene together, with the emphasis being on their connection. And that's a huge part of what makes it such a beautiful scene. As a side note, their love scene also reminded me of one and Bette and Tina's season 1 love scenes from The L Word, and I vaguely remember Eileen Shaken sharing that she watched a lot of lesbian cinema before the creation of The L Word, and that the cast were also shown lesbian films to take inspiration from. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that A Woman Like Eve was one of the influences for it. If anyone has any further tea or details about this, please put it down in the comments. Every now and then a subscriber will come through with a precious piece of lesbian lore that I had no idea about, so you never know. And speaking of influential, A Woman Like Eve also marks the beginning of the lesbian photography trope, the kissing in water trope, and the train station trope, all of which have been repeated many a time in other lesbian productions over the years, which is fun. You know what I'm going to say.
A true classic never goes out of style.
As for Ava and Lillian's relationship, Lillian offers Ava not only a way out of her marriage, but a new way of thinking about domestic dynamics and community. All throughout the film, there's an emphasis on Ava's disconnection and loneliness, conveyed through shots that often contain solely her, or her separate or being separated from other people. And that is contrasted against Lillian, who is often surrounded by people, specifically women, and seemingly connected and fulfilled. And in a lot of ways, Ava represents female isolation as a result of traditional lifestyle, and Lillian represents female community as a result of a non-traditional lifestyle, which is a lot of why their coming together is so interesting. And as a result of this, there's a lot of commentary in this film about how women have been segregated from one another through being tied and confined to nuclear homes, and how isolating this can be for them. And in fact, there's a scene in the film where Ava tries to mirror the female rich community that Lillian has at the commune by bringing all the women she knows together back home to discuss working together as a unit to ease their domestic burdens. And this conveys Ava's longing for community and connection, particularly with women, which notably is met by resistance from both her mother, who tries to redirect Ava's focus back towards her husband and children, and by Ad, who walks in on this meeting and shares his frustration that Ava hasn't prepared a meal for him yet, and that her focus is not on his needs for once. Ava's quest for connection is met by resistance from traditional expectation. And what's particularly interesting about Ad's reaction to Ava not having prepared food for him is he then goes out to a restaurant where he pays to have his meal cooked for him. So there's commentary here about how cooking is labor. And what's notable about this is that Ad doesn't recognize Ava's childcare, cleaning, and cooking as genuine labour. He thinks of himself as the only one who works. And I think the dynamics between Ava and Ad are interesting because both characters contain complexities and neither of them are a black and white, good or bad. Ad resents Ava's growing independence and assertiveness and feels entitled to all of her attention and energy. He also repeatedly reminds her that he is the one who financially provides, and that all the belongings they have are his, not theirs or hers. And Ava's contributions of domestic and emotional labour are completely discredited in this conversation, so she has no bargaining chips in terms of their possessions, including their car, which restricts her independence and freedom. And so in a lot of ways, Ad represents patriarchal control and traditional dynamics. And the film highlights how suffocating and unfair this can be for women. However, Ad is also a husband dealing with his wife having an affair and abandoning their family, which despite how taken for granted and suffocated Ava was feeling, it's hard to justify the way she went about things. For example, at one point in the film, Ava brings Lillian back home after a night out and places her on the sofa before joining her husband in bed, as though this is a perfectly normal thing to do, which to me suggested a cognitive dissonance going on, where Ava thought that what was happening between her and Lillian shouldn't have been an issue for Ad, and that Lillian having to share her with Ad shouldn't have been an issue either, which came across as selfish and oblivious behaviour that didn't take anyone else's feelings into consideration. And Ava's affair with Lillian is interesting because, on the one hand, Ava's a woman who has spent her life providing for others and putting her own needs second to theirs, a lot of which is never acknowledged or appreciated, and she is also her own person outside of being a wife and mother. But on the other hand, as a mother, she has a commitment to her children, and it's generally acknowledged that your wants and needs do become a secondary consideration to that of your children if you choose to have them. But at what point does a mother sacrificing her own desires become detrimental to her well-being and in turn affect her ability to look after said children? Where does the mother end and the woman begin? So there's nuance to the discussion about Ava's behaviour in the film. Personally, outside of bringing her side chick back home when her husband was there, I don't think Ava did anything wrong. Her abandonment of her children was only temporary, and the time she took away from them seemed necessary for her well-being. But let me know your own thoughts down in the comments. There's also a part in the film where Ava confesses to Ad that she's in love with another woman, and initially he downplays it in a patronising way, only to then fly off the rails when he sees Ava and Lillian sleeping together, and Ava leaves him over it, which is an authentic reflection of how lesbian relationships and affairs often aren't taken seriously or seen as any kind of romantic threat by men until reality comes knocking. And this mindset that lesbian relationships aren't something to be taken seriously is one that continues very much to this day. And so this is just one of the many examples of why A Woman Like Eve is still an incredibly relevant piece of work. As mentioned earlier, the film isn't a love story, and Ava and Lillian's relationship is more a complicated and realistic portrayal of two women trying to maintain a relationship under difficult circumstances than it is an idealistic fairy tale. Both women live very different lives, with Lillian being tied to her commune and Ava being tied to her children and their needs. So whilst Lillian gives Ava a way out of her marriage, she isn't able to give her the foundation she needs long term in order for their relationship to work. But despite the lack of a happy ending, since the way their relationship is presented is mostly healthy and authentic, I don't think the film encourages negative associations around same-sex relationships in any way. They fall apart due to circumstance, not because their relationship is immoral and needs to be torn apart as a cautionary tale. Another interesting aspect of the film pertaining to their relationship is the portrayal of how Ava is torn between her love for her children and her love for Lillian, who doesn't love Ava's children in the same way Ava does, because it doesn't demonize Lillian for not embracing the children, and instead portrays her reluctance to be a second mother in a more neutral and understanding light. And alongside this, despite Lillian having no emotional investment in the children, the film still portrays a healthy depiction of what same-sex parenting can look like, with the children shown to be happy and well looked after by Ava and Lillian. And this not only provided precious representation in a time where there was hardly any, but the positive portrayal also challenged the notion that same-sex parenting is somehow less than or damaging for children, all of which was incredibly progressive and brave to show for the time. The custody battle is another interesting aspect of the film, because it portrays how, at that time in particular, the courts tended to favour the mother, even if she had previously behaved in a neglectful way, which doesn't seem totally fair on the part of the father. And it's only when Ad is able to provide a maternal influence and heteronormative foundation does the battle finally go in his favour, and he wins it largely in part due to his weaponizing of Ava's sexuality against her. And all of this reflects how bias and discrimination factored into decisions during real-life child custody battles that led to unfair outcomes, especially during that period. This leads to Ava having to defend both her sexuality and her capabilities as a mother before the judge, and she points out that her sexual orientation has nothing to do with the way she feels about her children or her qualities as a mother. She also questions why children have to live in a traditional family, and really these questions are being asked to the audience as much as the judge, encouraging people to examine their own thoughts and biases. This scene was also really poignant because it represents the voiceless struggle of real-life lesbian and bisexual mothers throughout history, some of whom had their children unfairly taken away from them or were treated as unfit parents due to their same-sex attraction, despite their sexuality having no direct impact on their capabilities as mothers. And the fact that this film not only portrays this situation but challenges those biases is yet another example of why it's such a groundbreaking piece of work. In a lot of ways, A Woman Like Eve is similar to Je tu et elle, which is another female-directed film from the 70s containing feminist and sapphic themes, in that the situations that occur in the film are presented in a neutral light for the viewer to make up their own minds about. Now, the ending to this film is controversial because it can be perceived as Ava having lost everything over pursuing her own desires, especially as the biblical figure and story of Eve is a theme in the film, which adds weight to that angle and can be seen as attaching negative implications to Ava's lesbian affair. However, like everything else in this film, the meaning behind the ending is left to the interpretation of the viewer. And personally, I perceived it as Ava gaining her complete freedom and no longer being defined by or tied to anyone, with it being up to the viewer to decide if that is a positive thing or a negative thing. And as discussed, whilst the ending can be interpreted as Ava having ruined her life, it should also be taken into consideration that the film clearly depicted how deeply unhappy Ava was when she was boxed in by traditional expectations and subservience. So perhaps Ava is exactly where she wants to be by the end of the film. And it's also worth noting that the reason Ava is without her children at the end of the film is because she lost custody of them due to the prejudices against homosexuality. So the ending can also be interpreted as commentary on the injustice of that too. The image of Ava stood by herself is also a powerful one for the film to end on, because it allows the focus to be on just her and not her in relation to someone else, which was and still is a unique visual and concept in cinema, with female protagonists so often ending up in the arms of a romantic love interest, or with their children, or tethered to someone in some way. Yet another aspect of the film which makes it such a radical and refreshing piece of work. Overall, A Woman Like Eve is one of the most thoughtful and groundbreaking pieces of lesbian cinema to come out of the 1970s, and it's just fascinating to unpack from both a feminist and film history perspective. This is the kind of cinema that I enjoy doing an Italian hand about. This is the kind of cinema that I enjoy researching and talking about because it's got that juice. This is PG-13. Okay guys, if you've seen A Woman Like Eve, let me know what you thought of it down in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and to see you guys soon. Bye!